I am really honored to be here today because, as all of you here know, and many others, the Guild has been putting out fantastic workshops for the whole of the past year. And so many of us, people who weren't in London, are now able to see the great things that they've been putting out. So what I'm going to be talking about today is wartime hardship and lockdown plenty. And there have been inevitable comparisons between what was going on during World War II and what happened during COVID-19. Now, some of the similarities, they're very obvious. We all had to come together to beat an enemy, and strict regulations had to be imposed while at the same time keeping everyone's morale up. Now, here are the differences. In 1939, we were facing a tangible enemy, the German army, the German Air Force, who were intent on destroying and conquering Britain and the rest of Europe. But in 2020, we were also facing something, but this was an unseen force with COVID-19 around us, causing serious illness and death. Now, the length of time was also very different. Rationing lasted for 6 years, plus, this might surprise you, an extra 9 years after that. But what we've been through is about 14 months, maybe 15 months, and it's a lot shorter time. But the biggest difference of all was with the food. In 1939, the government had to work out how to impose rationing. And the idea was to equalise the population so that there would be necessary nutrition for everybody, whether they were rich or poor, everyone would get small amounts of necessities. But in 2020, there was an abundance of produce compared to the stark rations that we had during wartime. And just to tell you one thing, the talk is divided into 3 parts. The first part is pictures of the wartime, and the third part is pictures of lockdown. But the center is, I'm just going to talk a little bit about poverty and hunger. Now, rationing actually began on the 8th of January, 1940, when bacon, butter, and sugar were rationed. By 1942, many other foodstuffs, including meat, milk, cheese, and eggs, and cooking fat were also on the ration. Now, I'm going to show you, this is a typical weekly food ration for one adult. Now, when I've shown this picture before, sometimes talking to children, they all say, oh yeah, that's for a day, is it? But it's not for a day. Incidentally, meat was not rationed by weight, but by price. One was allowed to spend 1 shilling, which is 5p per week, and that provided a few ounces. Now, I want you to imagine eating the very small amounts I've shown you. Now, take the egg, for example, the third thing on the right, on down. Now, you wouldn't eat 1/7 of an egg. You'd save it all up and eat the whole egg all in one go. But once you'd eaten it, that's gone. That's your 1 egg for the week. Now, the amount of meat was tiny compared to portions today. Then the weekly butter ration. Now, I think we're quite lavish with butter these days, and we could easily use a weekly butter ration on a few pieces of toast in the morning, a couple of crumpets in the afternoon, and maybe a little dollop of butter on some corn cob or an asparagus or something, and that's your week's butter gone. Now, I tell you a little story about butter. When my husband was in boarding school, a long time ago, but after the war, he remembers a discussion with boys who mixed their margarine with butter to make it go further, or seem to. Now, he was upset because for him, adulterating the butter showed that they didn't care about it. And he argued that in that case, they should give their allowance to him. The next picture is milk bottles. Now, this photo shows 7 pints of milk. Now, the ration for a child was a pint of milk a day. Now, a pint was about half a litre. This was often delivered to the door by milk carts. The next one is the ration books. Now, you can see here a picture of the shopkeeper stamping the ration books. Now, the first thing I have to tell you is that the way this worked was every household was sent the required number of ration books for adults and children. And you had to register with a local shop. You couldn't just take your ration book to lots of different shops and buy little bits everywhere. So the storekeeper knew how many ration books he was going to have to deal with, and that was the amount of food that he got from the government. Now, for a child, it was really fascinating watching the tea. You can see the tea on the right there. And this, of course, was not tea bags. It was leaf tea. And what the shopkeeper used to do was to get a little square of paper and weigh out the small amount of tea that everybody was getting. And then in seconds, he'd create a perfect little package, no sellotape, nothing, and no tea ever leaked out of that. It was fascinating for a child to watch. Now, if you've got good eyesight, you might see at the bottom of this slide a fact that says Britain was never healthier than under rations. Now, this is not a surprise for those in government. Now, I'm showing you a picture of Cambridge University, part of it, and I'm going to just tell you why this is relevant. In 1939, two scientists at Cambridge University tested whether the UK could survive with only domestic food production if U-boats ended all the imports. Now, using food production data from the previous year, they fed themselves and other volunteers on a restricted diet of the items I've shown you, plus unlimited amounts of potatoes, vegetables, and wholemeal bread. They included 2 weeks of intensive outdoor exercise to simulate the strenuous wartime physical work that Britons would probably have to perform. The results of this trial were kept secret till after the war, but it gave the government confidence that food could be distributed equally to everyone without causing any widespread health problems. Now I'm going to show you a bit of propaganda. This is an advertisement for Rowntree's cocoa. And it says, a mealtime drink to make the meal go further. Rowntree's also promised that their drink helps to digest your other food. Not sure what that means, but presumably it meant vegetables. But the truth of it was that if you could have a hot drink while you're eating a small amount, it does make you feel more full. Now, this picture here is probably an iconic picture of wartime queuing. And queuing was a major part of everybody's day. You can see that they're all women, actually. The men weren't there. They were obviously off fighting the war. But I thought when I first saw this, aren't they clever? They brought something to read while they're in the queue. But that wasn't it at all. It was a fish shop, and customers were expected to bring newspapers to wrap the fish they brought. Now, fish wasn't actually rationed, partly because the Ministry of Food couldn't find an effective way to do it. Because the underlying principle they followed was that rationed items would only be those of which they could guarantee a constant supply. So in the case of fresh fish, the supply was governed by natural scarcity, caused by the uncertainty of how many fishermen were able or willing to go to sea. Now you all know what this is, fish and chips. This is two of the few foods not subject to rationing because the government feared the dish was so embedded in the nation's culture that any limit would damage morale. During the D-Day landings, it is said that British soldiers identified one another by calling the word fish, and an ally would respond, chips. Now we're going on to a different photograph, and something will strike you immediately that this is a colour picture and all the rest were black and white. For this reason, I think it's a little bit suspect, but I'll carry on anyway, telling you what it's about. It's about a shopkeeper weighing out an amount of wrapped sweets, which he's got in a glass jar. Now, this all looks very likely, but what is unlikely to me is because I'm intrigued with his elegant shirt and his pink satin waistcoat. Now, if this was early on during the war, it's likely that he would have had some fine clothes. But later on, with clothes rationing as well, it seems unlikely that he would have been able to include such a waistcoat on his allowance. But here's a thought. Perhaps his wife or mother had made the waistcoat for him out of some fabric they had at home. Now, I say that because my mother did exactly that. Just after the war, when I was about 6 and my brother was 8, she made fancy dress costumes for us to go to a party. I was dressed as Queen Elizabeth I and my brother as Sir Walter Raleigh. And the costumes were amazing, and they were made out of an old pair of velvet curtains. Now we come more to the sweets. Now, the ration book for a child was green. The allowance was 2 ounces a week. What sweets were available during the war? Well, the popular ones you could get in your local sweet shop were lemon sherbets, barley sugar twists, pear drops, and licorice all sorts. These were all hard, I'm telling you. There's a story about these, I'll tell you that. Apparently, Bassett's, the company that made them, had only one sales rep, and he was giving a presentation, and he'd laid out all the different colors of sweets on a tray. Somehow the tray got dropped and everything got mixed up. The client decided that he liked the mixed colors so much that the company changed their production. This is chocolate, which we would class in the same category as sweets, but chocolate was almost unobtainable. Some shopkeepers were said to keep a few bars of milk chocolate under the counter. But there was a story that one child got hold of a bar of something called X-Lax. Now, X-Lax was a laxative disguised as a small bar of chocolate. The recommended dose for constipation was 2 squares. Now, X-Lax had 12 squares, and this little boy ate the whole thing. And he was more than slightly uncomfortable after it. Now, looking again at this picture of chocolates, I want to tell you why I've put it there. My mother, believe it or not, had a chocolate making business. Before the war, she had gone to university, she got a maths degree, she became a teacher, and then she went on to do a course at the Cordon Bleu, a course, just a cookery course. And following that, what she did was she started her own chocolate business. She learned how to do tempering, fondants, all kinds of things. But sadly, her burgeoning business just folded because there was absolutely no chocolate to obtain. Now we come to another color photograph. And this one, no messing around, this one is a fake. It looks like it's wartime produce. The apples in the middle all look quite likely, and the cabbages on the side, but there's some things that are giveaways. First of all, the cauliflower on the left. It's what I call supermarket washed. You would never have got clean cauliflowers like that. They would have come with some soil on them. The leaves would have been much bigger and leafier. So that's a giveaway. But the main thing is the onions. There were no red onions in 1939-40s. In fact, there were only a very few of the brown onions, but the way these are strung up in plastic nets really makes me realize how it just wasn't true. But I will tell you at this stage something about my mum, and that is one day she came back from one of her many, many queuing trips to buy food which was not on ration, which would somehow appeared, and she'd heard that there were onions. She came back after 2 hours and she put on the table what she'd got, which was 2 onions. She was so excited. I wasn't. Now I'm going to show you what I call my selected ration items. Now, I prepared this slide when I was giving a talk to some children a couple of years ago, just to show them briefly what sort of things we had. But all of you will notice that there's one vital thing missing from this, and that is bacon. Now, bacon was considered an essential, so it had coupons quite separate from meat. Now, those who didn't eat bacon, Jews like me, Muslims and vegetarians were allowed an extra 3 ounces of cheese instead. Now that's why I have cheese in the middle of this picture. Now then look at the egg. Because, as I told you, my mother had trained as a cordon bleu cook, she was more than ever concerned about the 1 egg a week ration. How would she be able to make cakes or custard or things she always wanted to make? Everyone was encouraged to keep chickens, and this is what we did. I remember 2 things about my father during the war. One was that he went out on fire watch after every single air raid, and that meant that he had to walk around the local streets, and when he found a building that was burning, he had to walk to the fire warden's hut and report it. And he did this day after day throughout the war. But what he did at home was to look after the chickens. He fed them, he cleaned out their coop, and with me, he went to find the eggs. And I do remember putting my hand in and a lovely warm brown egg coming out. Now here's a picture of the 3 fruits which were totally unavailable during the whole wartime period: oranges, bananas, and lemons. I believe a pineapple was once seen by my parents, but I only knew about things that grew in England. The import of exotic fruit came to an end due to the wartime bombing of ships. From 1939, German U-boats attacked our merchant ships. Only homegrown fruits and vegetables like celery, carrots, and potatoes were available in the shops. Many people grew their own, encouraged by the Dig for Victory advertising campaign. The more food grown on allotments, the less would need to be imported by sea. I do remember one thing about fruit. I had an aunt who had a plum tree in her garden, and I remember the summertime and me going to pick them. I've never forgotten the taste of those golden yellow plums. For my whole life, I've always remembered what I call tree plums and compared the taste and juiciness with almost every other variety I've bought, but very little comes close. Now, bananas. This photo is different from all the others because look how happy everybody is. This was taken in 1946 in Bethnal Green in the East End of London. Now there are people milling around, and it must be an outside market stall, and there for some reason there's quite a lot of beetroot, which was always available, but look what's in the middle, it's bananas. There are many accounts you can read of first-hand experiences during World War II. One I read by someone describing his childhood told of how children really missed bananas. Now I think he must have been considerably older than me, because I had no memory of ever tasting one, so there was nothing to miss. So looking back now, I think the adults must have suffered much more from the short supplies and restrictions. After all, they had a memory of what it was like before, and I didn't. So now I am going to go on and talk to you a little bit about what I mentioned before. And the 2 things are poverty and hunger. Now, I'm going to be showing you later pictures of abundance and accumulation, how we stored too many things and there was always so much around, but available to those with the money to feed a family. Now, I don't think any of us were unaware of the poverty and need around us. Here, the government gave support generously. They did furloughing for people who had lost their jobs. There were people who fell out of the net, and they were the self-employed or people who simply couldn't afford it. So they relied on food parcels, lunches for school children who weren't attending school, and hot meals. And there was an army of volunteers and generous chefs who would cook and give away the food that they were making. I think the poverty really came home to me when I saw a picture from New York. One of our 4 sons lives in New York, in Manhattan, and he took to sending me pictures of what was going on around him, which was quite sad. And in one, I saw a line of hundreds of people queuing for 10 hours. At the end of that queue, they got one meal, and they were doing this every single day. Now, poverty is one thing, hunger is another. And this is where I'm going to introduce the book that I co-wrote with a lifelong friend, Monica Sears. And the book is called Episodes: Two Girls, Two Lives, One Time. The two girls were me and Monica. And we are both writing our memories from when we were 4 to when we were 11. Now, for me, it's hardship, but no deprivation. I was living in London under the bombing, the Blitz, and the blackout. But for Monica, hers was a completely different story. She was living in fear, hiding, and hungry. This is the background. Monica was born in Poland, and her father was taken away and disappeared just before the war. And her mother decided to take her baby into the Warsaw Ghetto, which was where the Jews had been forced to go. And after a very short time, she realized that they didn't have much of a future there, and she was desperate to get out. So she obtained some false papers, which enabled her and her child to get out of the ghetto and live on the ordinary side of Warsaw. Now, this was extremely dangerous because all the time they were running away from Nazi persecution. Now, for a period of about 9 months, Monica's mother had to go to work, and she worked in a factory, and she had to leave her child alone. Now, this is inconceivable today, to leave a small child alone for a whole day when the child is only about 4. But Monica had been told to do what she was told. And what she did was she stayed under the table, and all there was a book, a dolly, a few sweets or something to nibble, and a potty. And she did that every single day for 9 months. Now, I'm going to tell you one episode from this book. And this is directly about food. And here it is. Monica and her mother were moving from place to place, and they'd had to leave the apartment where they were living. But they decided that they were going to go back again to retrieve something. At least this was her mother's decision. Monica knew nothing about it. So they went together to the apartment block, and there were 2 soldiers outside with guns. And her mother, who dyed her hair a bright yellow, ran up to the soldiers, chatting, talking to them in German, and they waved her through. She turned to Monica and said, "Be nice for the kind soldiers. Just be good and play and wait till I come back." Well, it didn't take her very long to come back because her mother came out, and she came with her. She was holding a huge jar of goose fat. Now, what Monica didn't know was that at that time, bread and fat were more valuable than gold. You could have a handful of coins and it did you no good at all. And her mother had risked their lives to retrieve it. Now, having told you that stark story, the book has a lot of funny things in it as well, I have to tell you. There is only one remote similarity between what I've just told you and the past year in the UK. And that is getting food on the table at least twice a day. So now I'm going to go back to the screen share and hope it works again. Let's try it. And we're going to go.
We can see some of it, Judy. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
There, I hope. Is that full screen sharing? Yes?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
It is. So sorry about that, this wonderful technology. Right, now, the last bit. I'm showing you about lockdown, and I think this is where you will all engage, definitely, but you may have had very different experiences. Now, the first lockdown was in March 2020. You may know where this is. I don't know how many of you do. It is the famous Beatles crossing at Abbey Road. Now, day and night, it was always normally crowded with tourists, and now it's empty. This is also empty. This was the last time I went into a large supermarket, and I haven't been into one since, not because of this, but for other obvious reasons. So just as the lockdown was approaching, I went in and I saw that all these shelves were bare, but you can see what it was that was missing. It wasn't food that was short, it was toilet rolls. Now you may wonder, this is my husband, what is he doing? He's washing a £5 note. The early indications were that COVID could be caught in 1,000 ways, one of them from droplets or anything from a park bench to change given in a local food store. So here's my husband washing the droplets off a £5 note. Now, you may think, thank goodness, now she's showing us some food. Well, here it is. This is a tart that I made with puff pastry that I made from scratch because I enjoy doing that. And something interesting, which was frozen peach slices. Now, although the supermarkets were full of food, it was often hard to get a delivery slot. And there were some weeks when things just weren't available. And occasionally we were short of fruit. And it was in one of those weeks when other people were stocking up on tinned food that I discovered frozen peach slices, and it made an amazing, nice tart. Now, stuck at home, we all needed to make lunch and dinner every day. Now, this picture shows the sometimes odd situation where you could find something like heritage tomatoes, those lovely little yellow ones, but I didn't have any eggs. I put together this lunch dish with some rice from the night before, some fresh spinach, some little beans, and I wanted to put a poached egg on top, but I just didn't have one. During lockdown, I started to move from doing my food blog, which I still continue twice a week, to starting something quite new, which was a YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel was aimed at anybody who wanted to cook. It didn't matter whether they were good cooks or inexperienced cooks, and also a lot aimed at children, because people had children at home from school. They were trying to do homeschooling, but there were many times when they wanted to keep them entertained. And I reckoned that lunchtime was the best. So I found a collection of biscuit cutters and some sliced bread, and I cut them out. So there's the animals and the funny shapes at the bottom. And in the middle row, you can see 2 rounds. If you don't have the funny cutters, you can just make sandwiches with rounds. And when you've run out of bread, you can look at the rest of it. It's Carr's table water biscuits. So that was what it was like. Now, I wonder how many of you recognize this. If you've been coming to lots of Guild events, you'll know that this was from one of the workshops, and it was Georgian cheese bread. It was wonderful. I followed the instructions, and it was very interesting because there's no rising time and there's no yeast. I couldn't get the specific cheese they wanted, and I'm not sure I followed it all completely, but it really did taste good. Now, the next one is something that I called soup from nothing. I decided that an easy way to fill up at lunchtime was to have a big bowl of soup and very little else. And so this one was made by when I was one day waiting for a delivery and there was practically nothing in the fridge. So here's what I made from a couple of potatoes, some spring onions, an old manky lettuce, and a few peas. And I called it soup from nothing because I just buzzed it all up. But then there was one luxury in the fridge. I happened to have a carton of cream, so I swirled it around and made it more appealing. Here are 2 things which were hard to get. Many, many months you couldn't get it because people were hoarding it. People needed pasta. We weren't Italian, but we definitely needed pasta. And we needed rice. So instead of just buying one or two lots of it, people would stock up with enormous amounts. And the result was that there were some shortages. And supermarket deliveries often arrived with an unavailable message for those. But at the same time, there were constant little luxuries, like these cherries. And so, since I'm always playing around with photography, you may notice that the cherries on the left are glass cherries, and the other ones were the real thing. Very fun. Now, the next one, I can actually date this. This was last August. And this photo was taken after I had been on a little outing with one of our grandchildren. And she told me that she knew that in Hyde Park, there were blackberries. So we didn't go out into the country, we just went walking in Hyde Park. And there they were. And we each came back with a small bag, I have to tell you, not very many, a bit dusty, quite small blackberries, but just enough to make some cake. Now, what I'm showing in the cake is interesting. It's a lovely recipe. It has no butter in it. It has olive oil instead. So it is dairy-free. But the best thing is that it is suitable for people who were just catering for one or two. You know, the times of having 6 people sitting around for tea where you had a large cake, that had gone. So I was very keen that I wanted to make things in small portions that could be frozen. And then when we wanted one, just took it out of the freezer, zapped it for 10 seconds in the microwave, and it tasted just like it had come out of the oven. Sugar. Now, I'm not pretending that I'm working all the time. I was playing sometimes. And I found a bag of icing sugar. And of course, I didn't have a cake to ice. So I decided that what I wanted to do was to play. And I also found I had these edible pens. So I made a sort of flat mixture of icing, and I cut it out into shapes, and I cut out the shape of a house. And it was just a facade, but it reminded me of something. During the wartime, people obviously wanted to have wedding cakes, but with very few ingredients, it was impossible to make a 3-tiered cake. So apparently what happened was there was a cake look-alike made out of cardboard or something, and it all came to pieces. And at the bottom, inside, was a very small real cake. Now, butter. There was never any shortage of butter. Here is a generous dollop on some English asparagus, plus a view of the butter display from my local Tesco. Quite impressive. You may think I'd got into gardening, but I hadn't. This was mushroom pate. It really should have a sprig of rosemary in it, but all I had was parsley. But it's a really lovely recipe. Fried onions and mushrooms, buzzed up in a food processor with a bit of ground almond and parsley. Truly delicious. But it did remind me of something of wartime. I didn't like mushrooms, but Sunday evenings, my mum put on the table a supper, and I think it must have been just at the beginning of the week or the end of the week, and there was very little around, and we had mushroom stalks on toast. I won't say any more about that. Now, here are some things available in specialist shops where you could always find something unusual. The round courgettes, the courgette flowers, these multicolored radishes, they were around if you found them. Of course, Borough Market wasn't functioning, but sometimes you could see these things. Now here, I'm almost finished. I want to show you the picture that I took in February of this year. And I think this is what prompted me to think about the vast difference between the wartime availability and what we had. Because here you can see in the front, bottom, strawberries and pineapple, and then going up past the limes and all the oranges, there were chestnuts and dates and peaches, cherries, lychees, asparagus, and at the top, fennel, everything you could possibly have wanted. It says it all. Fresh food brought in from all over the world, with no shortages for the people who had money to buy it. How different this was from the days when my own childhood days. So there I am standing outside waiting to go in and pay for some things. And it was cold, you can see from the way I was wrapped up, but the warmth of everything around me was quite amazing. Now I'm going to show you a picture from episodes. This is me as a little girl of about 2 or 3, and that is Monica in Poland as a little girl of 2 or 3. And here is the book. If anybody wants to buy it, it's available from Amazon, and it's got some good stories. So I do hope that you might be interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for giving that presentation. We do have a few questions, and please